So tonight, myself and Kelly Hayden will be doing the presentation. I'm a conservation biologist with the Xerces Society. If you were not here last night, I'm based in Lincoln, Nebraska, and oversee the Great Plains Bumblebee Atlas, the Missouri Bumblebee Atlas, and the Nebraska Bumblebee Atlas. Also here with us tonight are Rich Hatfield, who's a senior conservation biologist with the Xerces Society, and our partners, Charlene Beskin and Daniel Kim from South Dakota Fish and Wildlife, as well as Laura Mendenhall from Kansas Fish and Wildlife, the Fish and Wildlife Service, sorry about that. And then Jerry, who is up in North Dakota with the Fish and Wildlife Service. Kelly, do you want to jump on and introduce yourself since you weren't here last night?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Kelly. I am working with the Xerces Society for the summer as a bumblebee technician. I actually started out as a volunteer with the Nebraska Bumblebee Atlas, so this is kind of an exciting step in the world of bumblebees for me. I will be helping out primarily with the Nebraska and the Missouri Bumblebee Atlases.
Thank you. Okay, so tonight we're going to talk about how to actually participate in the Atlas. Last night you got a good dose of bumblebee ecology and the declines and the threats that they're facing. Tonight we're going to learn about how you can sign up for this project to help us track and conserve bumblebees throughout the Great Plains. We're going to talk about the different survey types that you can do while you're in the Atlas, as well as how to conduct those surveys. We're then going to have a short break, and when we come back, we'll talk about bumblebee identification and go over the species that you might come across in your area. So everything that we're going to go over tonight is in the participant handbook, which is available on the website, bumblebeeatlas.org/GreatPlainsBBA. It talks about how to set up your Bumblebee Watch account, how to adopt a grid cell, how to conduct surveys. Everything we're going to go over is already written down, so don't worry if you miss something. There will be multiple ways to find the answer. But the first step when signing up for the project is to set up your Bumblebee Watch account. If you're familiar with eBird, it's very similar to that, but it's specific to bumblebees in Canada and Canada and the United States. So to start, you click sign up if you don't already have an account. You enter in your email address, your name, and then as you start submitting species, it generates a profile for you where it keeps track of everything that you've seen. You can submit bees from anywhere in the United States and Canada. There is a mobile app, but we're mostly going to be working off of the desktop version because that allows you to submit habitat data that we collect. It is important that you record your username from Bumblebee Watch because you're going to need that when you adopt a grid cell. So after you've set up your Bumblebee Watch account, you head over to the website, bumblebeeatlas.org/gpadopt, and there will be an interactive map there where you can select which grid cell you want to conduct your surveys in. So you can zoom in and out, you can search your address, you can search maybe a campground that you like to visit during the summer, you can search maybe your friend has a nice prairie that you want to go survey. You're free to adopt any grid cell that you would like to. The green cells are priority cells. So these are the areas where we really need your help this summer. The green cells were designated the way they are because they have records of species of greatest conservation need, or they're areas with really rich habitat, or they're areas where there are no bumblebee observations and we just want to get some sort of data. Once a grid cell is adopted, it will turn orange on the map so you can see where other people are surveying throughout the region. As soon as 5 people adopt the same grid cell, we close it off because we don't want more than 5 people surveying in the same area, right? So a goal of the Atlas is to get equal effort surveys across the entire state. So the more people that we have spread out, the better we'll be able to accomplish that. Once you've got your grid cell adopted, there are a couple of different survey types that you can run. So we're going to talk about those 2 surveys and habitat assessment and what it means to have an incidental observation. So the first type of survey is a point survey. And this is done in a single area that's about the size of a hectare, and it is 45 person minutes long. So that's active search time for bumblebees. And what we mean by person minutes is that if there is one person, you're actively looking for bumblebees for 45 minutes. If there are two people actively searching, your search time goes down to 22.5 minutes. If there are three people surveying, it goes down to 15 minutes, and so on. So the more people you have actively searching, the shorter your survey will be. During a point survey, you're going to do one bumblebee survey and one habitat assessment. And we're going to go over how to actually do those in a video that comes up. So I know there's going to be a lot of questions about that, but it will probably be answered in this presentation. The next type of survey is a roadside survey. So throughout the Great Plains, there is a lot of private land, and sometimes that land isn't accessible by the public. So the way that we can get around that is these roadside surveys. So a lot of roadsides are public access, right? So to do this, you're essentially going to be conducting 5 mini point surveys along a stretch of roadside. So you select a road stretch that's about 10 miles, and you're going to stop at least 5 times within that 10-mile stretch, a half a mile apart. And at each one of your stops, you're going to conduct a 15-minute bumblebee survey. So you're going to be looking for bumblebees for 15 minutes. And again, if there's 2 people, that time is cut in half. 3 people, you cut it in thirds. And you conduct 1 habitat assessment at each stop as well. So for completing a roadside survey, at the end, you will have done 5 bumblebee surveys and 5 habitat assessments. Please do wear bright colors or safety vests when you go out to these roadside surveys, because there are going to be cars moving by, sometimes at a pretty rapid speed. So after you conduct your bumblebee surveys, then we're going to ask you to do a quick habitat assessment. And these should only take about 5 to 20 minutes. Because you're doing it after the bumblebee survey, you'll have already walked the area and you'll hopefully be familiar with it. And in this assessment, we're just asking you to look around and notice what kind of habitat you're in. So we're going to give you, I think it's 7 different options to choose from of what habitat do you have. Is it a grassland? Is it an agricultural area? Is it urban? And you just check a little box. And then we're asking you to look at the surrounding area. So within direct view of your survey area outside of your hectare, what is the survey that surrounds, or what is the habitat that surrounds your survey area? And we want you to answer how many different flowering plants there are available, and make your best guess on how much of the area is actually in bloom. We're also going to have a few questions about management, and I will be walking through the data sheet later so that I can actually show you what this looks like. These surveys are not meant to be exhaustive. They'll go even quicker if you know your plant species. And then the last type of observation is an incidental observation. So these don't count as an official survey for your grid, but this is for like if you see a bumblebee in your backyard, or while you're walking the dog, or at any point when you're not conducting a bumblebee survey. If you want to take a picture of that and upload it to Bumblebee Watch, you're more than welcome to. These observations still count towards distribution of species and lets us know what kinds of plants bumblebees are using. So they're definitely still valuable. They just don't count as a survey because there's not a measure of effort involved or a habitat assessment. Okay, so when we're actually planning to conduct a survey, there's a few steps that you want to go through. And this workflow is going to apply to both point surveys and roadside surveys. So I'm going to talk about the planning stage. And then we have a video that we've recorded to show you more of how to actually do some of these things. So when to survey. The minimum requirement when you adopt a grid cell is that you're agreeing to conduct at least 2 surveys anytime between June and September. So that can be 2 surveys on the same day in different locations, 2 surveys on the same day in the same location. It can be more than 2 surveys. You're welcome to do as many surveys as you want, but the minimum is at least 2. And for conditions, you want to choose a day that's going to be between 60 and 90 degrees. If it's below 60 degrees, there won't be very much bumblebee activity going on because it'll be a little too cold. And same thing if it's above 90. Once it gets too hot, the bumblebees don't want to be out in that heat. You want to choose a day that's got winds of less than 15 to 20 miles an hour, because if it's too windy, the bumblebees will be at a lower activity level. And maybe this is obvious, but you don't want to choose a day when it's raining. So the best advice I can give here is to remain flexible, right? Sometimes you might go survey in a beautiful alpine meadow on the West Coast and it decides to rain. And that's going to happen. So my best advice is to remain flexible, bring a change of socks. Everything will be okay. And when you're picking a location to survey, you can choose natural areas, urban areas, public roadsides and right-of-ways. Wherever you do choose to survey, make sure you're following all posted rules and regulations, and try and select somewhere that has some abundant blooms, attractive flowers. That being said, if you find somewhere that doesn't have any blooms or flowers, you're still welcome to do a survey there, as that data is still very relevant, right? If we find areas where bumblebees are not thriving, that's still valuable information to know. So we have this handy Google map of the grid cells that you can find on the website. And you can use this map to, again, search for parks or hiking trails, biking trails, picnic areas, campgrounds, any sort of recreation space might be a good spot to survey. You can zoom in and out of the cells. You can use the search bar. You can manually zoom in and out if you want. A good idea sometimes is to look for green areas, like all of these on the map. You can see who owns them to see if it's a public area that you can access or not. There is some permitting involved for each of the states. So in Kansas, each volunteer, regardless of where you're surveying, is going to need a permit. So in your confirmation email, after you adopt a grid, you'll be emailed a general permit that you'll want to print and bring into the field with you whenever you survey. Before you visit any of the state managed lands, you want to make sure to contact the appropriate area manager before you're surveying, just to let them know your name and your details of about where you're going to be and when you're going to be, just so they know who's going to be out there. Similarly, for South Dakota and North Dakota, general permits will be emailed when you adopt a grid cell. Please print them and bring them with you into the field. And you also want to contact the appropriate area manager before visiting the managed lands. All of the contacts that you'll need to find are on the Great Plains website and in the handbook. For federal lands, for U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service property, you're going to want to contact the state's Fish and Wildlife Service Ecological Services Office before surveying to arrange details. One of the biologists from our partners here is likely going to have to accompany you. So we want to arrange that before you actually arrive at a refuge or waterfowl production area. For national parks, we're still working out some kinks with the permits, but anybody who adopts a grid cell will be emailed when that's ready to go. So should you have an interest in surveying one of these national parks, you will hear about that when it's time. U.S. Forest Service land, no permits are needed, but they're asking that you contact the appropriate district before you survey. Again, all of those contacts are listed on the website. Okay, so materials that you want to bring with you into the field. Obviously, your data sheets and a writing utensil, your insect net and vials, a cooler with crushed ice. So again, we're chilling the bees, which you're going to learn in the upcoming video, to mobilize them to take photos with. And we find that crushed ice usually works best for this. So when you're heading out to do your survey, pick up some ice on the way out to your site. You also want to bring a camera to photograph the bees. Usually a digital camera that has a macro setting works best. But some people get away with smartphones or using the macro clips that attach right to a smartphone. You'll also want to have access to a GPS unit, or similarly your smartphone if you can pull up Google Maps because you want to record the location of where you're at. You'll also want a timer. Again, your smartphone can work for this to keep track of that active search time while you're in the field. You're also going to want something to record the weather with, to note down the wind speeds and the temperature. And then it's also a good idea, if you're not super familiar with your plants and your bees, is to bring a field guide with you. Sometimes iNaturalist can work really well in the field, depending on where you are. And it's also a good idea to bring paper maps because there's a lot of rural areas. And if you run out of service or your phone dies and you don't have access to the internet anymore, you'll want a way to get out of your survey spot. All of these are listed in a supplies list on the handbook, and there's also more details about each of them online. Okay, so that's the planning phase of it. And then before we jump into the video, I just want to give you a quick look at the data sheet because the video that we're going to be showing is a couple of seasons old and the data sheet has changed a little bit. So this is what the Bumblebee data sheet looks like. And the first part that you're going to want to fill out is the top, where your site name is, your location, and the date. The site name is completely up to you, whatever you want to call it, something that you'll remember. And then you want to record the latitude and longitude, the date. You'll also want to record your grid ID. There's a spot to circle whether you're doing a point survey or a roadside survey, how many surveyors are with you, and then some temperature details like wind, speed, cloud cover, and then the temperature. You're also going to want to record the start time and the end time of your survey. So start time would be when you start filling out the data sheets. Your active search time would go into survey minutes. When you're done with everything, you can write in the end time. Collection method. So there are multiple listed here, but when you're completing a formal survey, we would like you to capture and photograph all bees that you see. That is best case scenario. There may be a time when there are too many bees for you to catch and you try and only catch the ones that look different. Please let us know if that's the method you took, but when you're surveying, try and collect every single bee that you see. We have these grids over here on the side so that when you're photographing your bees, you can place them on a grid so that we get an idea of the size of the bee. And then this main part is where you're going to be recording each of the bees that you collect, the host plant that they were collected on, and there's a spot for your photo numbers, and that's when you look on your camera after you've taken a picture, it should have a file number. And it's going to be really important that you remember which photo file number goes with your Bumblebee because you don't want to mix those up when you're uploading the data. There's a spot for you to check off which bees you've entered when you're putting everything into Bumblebee Watch, just as a way to quality control that you don't enter a bee twice or you forget to enter one. So this is what an example might look like. You can see this person was out at Pete's Ranch. They recorded their latitude and longitude, did a survey on June 15th in the future, did a point survey. You can see that a few of the bumblebee species down there, it's okay if you don't know what bee you're actually looking at. You can write unknown. Somebody, when you upload it, will identify it for you if you don't know it. So then the habitat assessment, you're going to start with the same information that's on your habitat, on your Bumblebee data sheet, so that the two match. So if you're doing a roadside survey, you make sure that you have the same data sheets together. The first question is going to ask about the survey area. So what habitat type are you actually surveying in? Is it agricultural land? Is it developed? Is it a roadside grassland? Riparian is an area along a stream or a creek. Shrub steppe is a low rainfall grassland or arid land. Are you in a wetland or a woodland? So you just check one of those. And then for the surrounding area, remember this is anywhere outside of your direct survey area that is within sight. you can select the 3 most abundant habitat types. So this person was mostly surrounded by agricultural land. There was a little bit of grassland, but that's all they saw. So you only have to fill out the first one. The second and third most abundant options are optional. Next, there's a question about how much of the area has flowering resources available. So as you look around, you're going to assess the flowers and notice how many of those are still offering pollen or nectar. Sometimes it can be kind of hard to tell, but again, just do your best guess here. So an area that's pretty low on the scale would be a picture of the grassland on the left. One that would be very high, almost above that, would be the one on the right. It's completely filled with Monarda. Then the next question asks about features and if you see them in or near the survey area. So bunch grasses, leaf litter, rodent holes, pine needle duff, rock piles, all of those options are things that we associate with bumblebee nesting. So we want to get an idea of what resources are in the area that could be associated with bumblebee nests. Bunch grasses, for those of you that are unfamiliar, would look a little bit something like this. And then the last question is asking about management. So if you see mowing, if you see livestock grazing, if you see native grazing, and that might be animals themselves in the area, but it could also be hoof prints or scat. It's asking if you see agriculture, if you see insecticide or herbicide use. Sometimes there will be a sign about it. If it's herbicide use, you might see a lot of yellowing on the plants themselves. It's going to ask about fire. So as you walk around the ground, if you see ash on the ground, or there's a lot of black sticks hitting your thighs as you walk through, that might be a sign that there was fire recently in that area. And then we want to know about honeybee hives. So if you saw them and how many boxes did you see? You can also write suspect here if maybe you saw a lot of honeybees in the area while you were surveying, but you didn't actually see a hive near you. Then on the back side of the habitat data sheet, it asks how many different flower species, including trees and shrubs, are blooming that were not visited by bumblebees. So these are going to be the different types of flowers. Instead of how many flowers are blooming, we want to know how many different species are available. And we're asking only for the species that were not visited by bumblebees, because those that were are already going to be submitted with your bumblebee observation. So we don't need to double count them. And then we're going to ask you to record to the best of your ability the name of each blooming plant. So not grasses, but forbs or herbaceous flowering plants, trees, and shrubs. If you don't know the name of them, again, it would be good to try and use a field guide or iNaturalist. There's many plant ID apps out there that work pretty well. You can take pictures and try and send them to somebody that knows their plants. If you come across something like a thistle or sunflower, is helpful, not a sunflower, let's focus on a thistle. It's really nice for us to know if it's a native thistle or a non-native thistle. So if you don't know what species it is, try and take some good pictures of it so we can assess that later on. Because if you just upload it as thistle, it's hard for us to categorize that. And then at the end, there's a spot for your volunteer data. So you want to keep track of your total time, including your planning and your driving time to conduct this survey, as well as how many miles round trip you traveled to get there. And this just allows us to see how much time volunteers are actually contributing to conserving bumblebees. It usually ends up to be a really amazing number. So please keep track of that, and it'll be asked for it when you submit data online. Okay, and then photographing. So this is going to be shown in the video, but I just want to give you a little preface here before it's thrown at you. So when we're looking to identify bumblebees, there's a few key things that we need to look at in the pictures. So when you take your pictures, make sure you get a nice photo of the face. And it needs to include the front of the face and the top of the head. And some of these bees will have different color hairs in these locations. Next, you want to look at the thorax. If you can get a top-down view so that you can see the pattern on the bee's thorax. If you can get a profile view, like the photo you see here, that allows us to see the color of the hair on the side of the thorax. And then you just want to look for patterns. So some bees will have bands in between their wings, like the photograph here. Some might have circles. Some might have solid colors in there. There's lots of different patterns, so we need to be able to see the thorax very clearly in the photographs. And then the last part is the abdomen. So the abdomen is split into 6 different sections on a female bee, 7 on a male. And each section is called a tergite. And we abbreviate that to T1 for tergite 1, which is the abdominal segment closest to the head, all the way down to T6 or tergite 6, which is the most posterior end where the stinger would come out. So each tergite can have different patterns on it, different colors of hair, and that's how we identify different species. So all of these things that need to be photographed are on your data sheet, not the data sheet, on the Bumblebee identification sheet. So if you bring that into the field, you'll have this list with you of what needs to be photographed. Another thing that Rich is going to talk about in the video is cheek length. We talked about this a little bit last night, but one of the ways we can identify bumblebees is by their cheek length. So on the left, we have a short cheek bee, and on the right, we have a long cheeked bee. It's a little bit easier to see them on these wonderful macro photos. We probably won't be taking photos like that, but if you do, hats off to you. But just be aware that this is something that we're looking for. So if you get really nice, clear shots of the face, we can usually tell the length of the cheek. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing this screen and I'm going to get the video up and going.
Today, I'm in a beautiful natural area. It's a nice, warm, sunny day. I've got my net and I have some vials in my pocket, so I'm pretty much ready to do a survey. The first thing you want to do is make sure that the site is big enough. It needs to be about a hectare. And a hectare is about the size of a football field, lengthwise, square. So sort of a football long and the same distance wide. It's 100 square meters, so a football field, including the end zones. Another way to think about it is the infield of a track. If you ever ran track, the entire infield on the inside of a running track is about a hectare, or a soccer field is also about a hectare. So you want to make sure it's big enough. And then usually what I do once I decide that it's a big enough site is I walk around and I make sure that there's enough flowering resources. You want to make sure that there is something that bees could be visiting. Otherwise, it's probably not worth really conducting a survey, or maybe come back at a later date when there are flowers. One of the things you want to do when you're out pre-walking your site is make sure you're keeping an eye out for inconspicuous flowers. Sometimes flowers will grow down amongst the grass, but they can be important for bumblebees and often are. This plant is called self-heal and often grows underneath the understory or overstory of grass and is a great bumblebee plant. Another important thing when we're out looking for bumblebees is we want to make sure we're looking at all blooming plants. If I was standing here looking in this patch, I might be drawn to the violets, to the dandelions, or maybe to the bluebells over here. But in reality, one of the most attractive plants in this patch has green inconspicuous flowers, but bumblebees love it. This is a plant called waterleaf, and the flowers aren't quite open yet because it's still very early in the season here. But these little green guys here are going to bloom into little beautiful little flowers that hang down sort of under the understory, and they often can't be seen. But bumblebees like Bombus flavifrons and other long-tongued species really love these flowers and will visit them. So while you may not be drawn to them with your own eyes, it's really important to pay attention to what's blooming and making sure that we're spending time looking at all the flowering resources on the landscape, looking for different species of bumblebees. Other things you may want to look for as you're doing a pre-walk around your site are things that may be a potential hazard. You may want to avoid plants like poison oak or blackberry, although it is notable that both of these plants do flower and can be attractive to bumblebees. You'll also want to look out for holes or other things to avoid, like electric lines, fences, barbed wire. Just make sure you're safe while you're doing your survey. You also want to keep an eye out for property lines to make sure you're not crossing from public land onto private land. And also keep an eye out for areas that you may want to spend a couple more minutes, areas with high quality forage that you know are especially attractive to bumblebees. Or keep an eye out for blooming trees, meaning don't forget to look up. There are sometimes flowers that are above your head that can also be attractive to bumblebees. Once you've finished your pre-walk, you're ready to start your survey. Materials that you want to make sure that you have with you before you begin your survey are an insect net, jars to place your bumblebees, a cooler with crushed ice. Make sure you have a timer. And then for processing your bees, you'll need your data sheets as well as a camera. We recommend having a dedicated camera, ideally with a macro function, but in a pinch, a smartphone can work as long as you learn how to control your white balance and take high quality photos with it. I typically set up a station in the middle of my survey area, which has the cooler and the area where I'll process the bees later. And then I grab a handful of vials and head out to go conduct my survey. And when you're conducting your survey, you want to make sure it's 45 minutes long, and that's 45 person minutes. So if you're doing it with a friend, you would do it for 22.5 minutes. And if you did it with 2 other friends, it would be for 15 minutes. You just want to have 45 total minutes of search time. The important thing also is that when you're doing a survey, you want to pause the timer while you catch a bee. So it's 45 minutes of searching, not 45 total minutes. So you want to pause the timer when you catch a bee, and while you're putting that bee into a vial, and while you're putting that vial into the cooler. That doesn't count for your search time. The other thing that's important while you're doing your survey is you want to make sure that you're associating every bee observation that you have with a flower. So one of the important things about the Atlas project is we want to learn what resources that bees are using. So while you're out collecting bees off of flowers, you want to make sure to record that information so that we can gather it later and use that information when we analyze the data from the project. So with each bee that you capture, you want to also record the flower on which you captured it. Catching a bumblebee in a net is not an easy task. It takes a lot of practice. So one of the things that we recommend is that you spend some time practicing in your backyard before you go out and actually conduct your survey. That way you'll get some competency and some confidence so that when you see a bumblebee during your survey, you'll actually be able to net it. There are really 2 different ways to go after a bumblebee on a flower. One way is to just swing your net and try to catch it in there like this. The important thing is after you've swung, you want to make sure to turn your net over to close the bottom of it so that the bee doesn't come flying right out into your face. There's a number of ways to do that. I like to do a little flip, but the easiest way to do it is to swing and then just turn the net over 1-2 times. And then you'll have the bee in this section of the net that's laying over the top. The other way to go after a bee instead of sweeping is to just go over the top and drop the net on the bee like that. That way the bee will be trapped in the net. The next step then would be to grab the bottom of the net and pull it up to the top, and the bee will fly right to the top of the net because it's attracted to the sun. Let's see if we can find some bees to practice on. Sometimes you just have to go and follow for her a bit. She looks like she's looking for a nest, so they can be really hard to track. But we can just throw the net over the top of them like that sometimes while they're flying. And I got her. I can see her moving in the net there. So what I do is I pull the net then up to the top and make sure she's under there. I see her right in there, and then I can put her in the vial. Okay, so now that I have a bee in the net, what I need to do is get the bee from a net into the vial. And the way I'm going to do that, she's somewhere in this folded over area. I can see her crawling around right here. And so what I want to do is make sure she gets all the way down to the bottom of the net. So what I can do is I can just take the net and just go back and forth a couple of times and then fold it over, and then I like to grab it when I know she's above my hand here. So I know that she's between my hand and the bottom of the net. And then I can take my jar, take the top off, but I want to keep that cap close by. And so then what I do is I stick the jar into the net, and it goes through my hand here, okay, so that there's no way for the bee to get out. And then what I can do is just sort of move the net around until I'm sure that I have the bee in the net. And unfortunately, my net is very dirty, so it's hard for me to see. But I can hear her. I know she's in there. And usually you'll hear that sound when you know she's in your jar. I know that she's in the jar. And now I can just use the net basically as the top of my jar. So I'm just going to reach my hand in, and again I'm going to grab that plastic vial, and I'm just pulling the top of the net over the top of the jar, so the net is still serving as the top until I get to the edge, and then I'm just going to slide it directly into and put the cap directly on, and then I can close the top and I can see the bee there in the jar. And that is how you transfer, or at least one method for transferring a bee from a net into a jar. Okay, so now I want to show you another method for getting a bee from a net into a vial. You can see the bees crawling around in the vial right here, and I'm sorry, in the net right there, and I want to get her into the vial. So one thing is a good thing to do. Some people just aren't comfortable holding the net while they do this, so they like to put it on the ground. But you can see if I hold the net straight up, the bee will fly all the way to the top of the net, okay? And then I can move forward. So some people just like to set it on the ground and then use the ground sort of as the cap, and then stick the vial into the net. And then again, same principle. You can pin the bee against the net as the top, and then you can stick your other hand in there and just put the cap on, and then you'll have the bee in the jar. Simple as that. And then what we want to do is we want to take the bee once it's in a vial, and we're going to put it into the ice pack. And it's ideal to stick it as far into the ice as we can so that the ice is completely surrounding the bee, and then it'll chill very quickly so that we can take the photographs that we need to take. Normally, one of the things that I would do in this situation is I would take the flower that I captured this bee on, and I would put it into the jar so that later when I was processing my bees, I could know which flower that I caught this bee on. And keeping that keeping track of that is very important for the data we're collecting for the Atlas project. Or in this case, because this bee wasn't visiting a flower, it was just flying around, it's not going to have any floral association. So if I don't put a flower in there, then I'll know that when I process my data later. But if I'd captured this bee on, say, a dandelion, I could come over to a dandelion flower and just grab the flower off and pretty easily just tuck the flower into the jar with the bee. And then later when I process this bee, I'd have the flower and the bee in the same jar so that I can keep track of it. Other people like to take notes and have a notebook, and they will number their vial and say this would be bee number 1. They could go bee number 1 and they would write down the flower or take a picture of the bee next to the flower. There's lots of different ways to keep track of it. We don't care which way you do it. We just care that you do it. So when I finish my survey, I like to get a station set up to take my photographs. I want to make sure that I have everything I have and everything I need before I get started, because when I take the bees out of the cooler, they're going to start warming up, and I want to make sure that I have everything. So I want to make sure that I have my data sheet and a pencil that has lead in it. So I want to make sure I can take my notes. And I want to make sure that I have my camera. The other thing I like to do is make sure that my camera is set so the pictures I'm going to take are appropriate for the lighting conditions. So I usually will take a cap of a vial or something like that and make sure that I have my camera in the right settings before I get started, so I don't have to wait while the bee is warming up. So I get it in my macro setting and make sure that the pictures that I take look good. So here I am, I'm going to take a picture. And that looks pretty good. You can see here. It looks pretty good. I could probably add a little bit of light. It's a little bit dark, so I may change the white balance a little bit, but for the most part, it looks pretty good. So once I'm ready and I've got the information that I need, I can start processing my bees. But first I want to make sure I've filled out the top of my data sheet. So I have my site name and my grid cell ID in here, along with the date and the survey method, my weather information, and the surveyors and the survey time. All of that's entered on the data sheet, and I can get ready to enter the bees. Now each line on your data sheet here is going to represent a vial. So each bee that you captured gets its own line. So you're going to enter what bumblebee species that you think it is, its host plant, and then the photo numbers that you need, that you took of that bee. I'm going to move and process my bees in the direct sunlight here because it often will take a different picture or a better picture if you have direct sunlight. Sometimes it's too bright. You just have to take a look at the pictures that come out of your camera and adjust your settings and your location appropriately. And I can't stress this enough. I get way too many photos that people took that are out of focus or are too bright or are too dark. And if someone goes through all of this trouble of collecting bees, puts bees in jars and bees in the jars in a cooler, and then takes pictures that doesn't allow me to identify them, a lot of that effort has been wasted. So taking pictures is really the most important thing that you can do. And I want you to make sure to get your settings right and take the time you need to get the best pictures that you can. So I'm ready, my station's all set up, I have everything I need. I can grab my first bee out of the cooler. And once you take a bee out of the cooler, you'll know she's ready to be processed if you can kind of shake the jar back and forth, and she moves pretty freely in there. That's when you know she's ready to be processed. And so usually what I do is I'll just dump her out onto some surface, and if you have white, that's great, it works really well. Other colors can work too. Darker colors, just something that's flat and neutral usually helps pretty well. So one of the things that we can do when we look at our bee, remember there's a lot of different photos that I need. I need to be able to see the picture of the face. I need to be able to see a picture of the thorax. and I need to be able to see a picture of the abdomen, including all of the segments back there. And for yellow-faced, yellow-striped bees, I need to see a picture of the underside of the abdomen. That allows me to tell the differences between some very close look-alike species. So when they're completely out is a great time to take a picture of that underside of the abdomen if you have that species. And in this case, I do. So I want to get really close if you can, and this is why a camera with a macro setting is really the best option. You want to get as close as you can, and you want to take a nice picture of the underside of the abdomen. Okay, so now I can see the color of those hairs on the abdomen, which is exactly what I need to see. Also, when she's in this position, I can often take a very good picture of the face. And it's nice to take a nice close-up like this, because then I can see the cheek length as well as the color of the hairs on her face and the colors of the hair on the top of her head. I also like to include a profile shot like this. Okay? And one of the nice things about a shot like this is I can see the hairs on the face, on the thorax, and on the abdomen. And now I want to be able to make sure that I can see every single segment on that abdomen and then the color patterns there. So you want to sometimes peel those wings apart and make sure you get a nice clear shot. It's okay if your hand is in there, but we really just want to be able to see all of the segments back there on the abdomen. Perfect. And then she's ready. I've taken all of the photos that I need for her. You can see there that her foot is starting to twitch a little bit and she's starting to wake up. But I've taken all the pictures that I can of her. And so what I can do is I can actually just set her in the sun and let her warm up. And she'll slowly warm up and groom herself and fly away. And then I can go on and process the next bee. But before I do that, I want to make sure I enter this one on my data sheet. So because this has a yellow face and a yellow stripe, and you notice that all the hairs on the underside there were black, I know that this is Bombus vosnesenskii. And if you don't know the species of bee that it is, it's totally fine. You can just write Bombus here. And I'm going to write the host plant. In this case, there is no host plant. I found this bee just flying around, probably looking for a nest site. So I'm just going to write nest searching. And then I want to write the photo numbers. So in my camera here, I'm going to open it up, and I'm going to open up, and I'm going to take a look at the photos that I took. And down here, it's going to tell me the number of the photo that I took. And I want to record that information on the data sheet. So these photos started at 2319, and I'm going to write that on here, and that goes through 2324. Okay, and now that's all the photos that I've taken of that bee, and I've entered all the information that I need to from that particular bee on the data sheet. Now I can process my next bee. Again, I can shake the bee in the jar, and if she moves around freely, I know that she's ready to be processed. I can dump her out onto the table. And again, this is not a yellow-faced, yellow-striped bee, so I don't need a picture of the underside of the abdomen. I just need a picture that shows the face, head, thorax, and abdomen. And I can get a lot of that from a single shot with this bee, the way that she's set up. I can get a nice profile shot. And there I can see pretty much everything I need to from a single photo. I'm going to roll her over on her back to make sure that I get a photo of the cheek length and of the face. Sometimes the antennae get in the way there, so you want to make sure, if you can, to get the photo that you need. Okay? So there, really, with just two pictures, I can get everything that I need. But there, in this case, I can also get a nice shot there that'll show me every segment of the abdomen. And this species here is Bombus Mixtus. It's got brown hairs at the very back of its abdomen that little crescent on T2 there, and you can see it's got cloudy hairs on its thorax, so a mix of yellow and black hairs, and a nice short cheek. So I'm done processing that bee, and I can put her in the sun as well. So now I can write this one as Bombus Mixtus. She was also nest searching. And the photo numbers, again, I go into my camera, I press preview, and this goes through 2327. So this is going to be 2325 to 2327. One of the things you can do when you're done processing your bees is you can actually hold them in your hands. It's a really neat opportunity to get up close and personal with a bee and see how they move their wings and groom themselves. It's a really, really neat opportunity. But they do warm up pretty quickly, and it's pretty neat to watch them fly away and notice that even after being in a cooler for a long time, they can go out about their business and just fly away. Oh, there she goes. When you're done with your bumblebee survey, we're going to ask that you also do a brief habitat survey. And there's just a series of questions that you have to answer as you walk around the site. There's some just basic site information at the top of the data sheet, and then we get into the habitat area. The first thing you want to do is decide what is the most appropriate habitat type.
All right, let me get back to the PowerPoint here. Rich, is there any questions that we should go over right now? I switched the screens back. All right, 1 second. Sorry, everyone, my computer is being a little finicky right now. All right, are we seeing the correct screen?
Yep.
Perfect. Okay, so we're just gonna go over how to submit data now, and then we're gonna take a quick break and we'll come back and talk about Bumblebee identification. So after you've done.
Hey, Katie.
Yep.
I wonder if it might make sense to answer a bunch of these questions that came up during the video and afterwards, before we sort of move on to something else that folks might have questions about.
Yes, good idea.
Okay. There was one question, and maybe, I guess we didn't probably watch that part of the video, but about when the question on the data sheet about how much in bloom, how do we answer that question?
Yeah, so that one is going to be your best judgment. If you're in an area that has a lot of flowers in bloom, like most of your survey area has something in bloom, you're probably pretty high up on the spectrum, probably 80–90%. If there's only a few flowers in bloom in your area, it's probably going to be about 10%. So the things that you count as in bloom are flowers that are offering pollen and nectar still. If you see insects visiting them, it's probably a good chance that they're still blooming and offering foraging resources.
Yeah, I like to tell people the way to think about this isn't sort of as percent cover. Like if you're standing in one place looking down at the ground, obviously it's going to be pretty rare to get up to 100% of flowering unless you're in the field that's behind Katie there. But it's more like in how much of the plot were there flowers that you could look for bumblebees on? So, could you swing a net in 10% of it, or in 100% of it, or somewhere in between? So if you're standing and sort of within reach of you are flowers that could be visited by a bumblebee, that would be considered a portion of the plot that's flowering. But if you're often walking sort of between patches of flowers, those would be the areas that would be sort of unflowered and not have suitable flowering resources. So not really percent cover, more just like how much of the plot had flowering resources that allowed you to search for bumblebees. That's what that question really relates to. This next question is specific to Missouri, asks if permits are necessary in Missouri. And I would just say, to answer that question, it's really important that you just get permission to survey wherever it is that you're surveying. So, if you're going to public land, just try to reach out to the land manager and let them know that you're coming. And generally speaking, and there's another question lower down here about sort of smaller parks and towns and things like that. And I would just say, generally speaking, people are really supportive of this idea. I think most land managers understand the importance of pollinators, and for the most part, don't have the capacity to do work like this and want the information coming out the back end about land management. So I think you're going to find generally that land managers are supportive, but we want to work with them and make sure that we're not, going to sensitive areas and other things like that. So please just reach out to land managers and have permission to work there. And if you need some help, our Bumblebee team can help do some of that outreach for you. Although we would prefer, since you'll be the person that's there, sort of to initiate that contact. So, but again, if you need help, let us know.
I will say to that to survey on Missouri Department of Conservation lands, there is a volunteer waiver that you need to sign. And you also need to contact the manager that oversees that area before going out there. And that form is on the Missouri Bumblebee Atlas website.
A couple questions about nets. What's the best size net to use, Katie?
Oh boy, I don't know if I know the dimensions of my net. 14 to 16 inches, I think, is what I work with. The best thing that you want to make sure when you're purchasing a net is that you get an aerial insect net. You don't want a sweep net. Sweep nets usually come with hard canvas. You want a mesh lining so that you can see through that net. There are links to some nets on the website, but if you also just do a Google search of aerial insect net, you'll probably find a lot of options. You have anything to add to that, Rich?
I think I use a 12-inch hoop on the end of my net, and I like it. But a lot of other people use like a 15-inch, a little bit bigger size. 18-inch probably gets up to be a little bit too big, so probably somewhere in that 15-inch range is a good size. You also want to make sure that the hoop is sturdy, like so when you sweep it through vegetation, it's not going to flop around. So yeah, a sturdy, 12 to 15-inch net is probably about the size that you're looking for.
Yeah. And
the net that Katie recommends on the Bumblebee Atlas website there from Home Science Tools is a great net. It's got a nice short handle, nice stiff rim, nice long net bag. It's a good net. Let's see. How long can bees safely stay in the cooler? Can they sting when they wake up? And how tough are they? Do we need to worry about hurting them as we're doing this work?
Well, I mean, they are alive, so we want to be gentle with them, but bumblebees are pretty resilient creatures. They can stay on ice for a long period of time. I won't name any names, but there are people that have left them overnight on ice and they've been okay. Obviously, you don't want to intentionally do that, but for your 45-minute survey area, it should be totally okay to have to be on ice. They can sting. When you're surveying out in the field, though, bumblebees are on a mission to go from their nest to a flower and back, though, so they're not looking to sting you. That being said, if they feel the need to defend themselves, they certainly can sting you. You'll start to notice as the bumblebees wake up from being chilled, they're going to take a few seconds to groom themselves. They might vibrate their wings, and you'll be able to tell if they're agitated, right? They're going to be vibrating and spinning around. And if that's happening, don't stick your hand near the bee. Just let it sort of do its thing, and it will warm up and fly away. I have not been stung very many times. I think I've been stung by a bumblebee once. So the chances are low, I would say.
Don't have anything to add there.
Okay.
Question here. If bumblebees are not on a flower, you caught them foraging or flying around, is it assumed that they're nest searching, or is there something else they should write down that might explain the behavior when they were caught?
It is not assumed that they're nest searching because we won't be surveying during that time. So bumblebees will be looking for nest locations in the spring. Hopefully they've already established their nest by the time we're surveying in June. If you do catch one in the air, you can just write no floral host. It's likely that they were flying to or from their nest location in between a flowering resource.
And then one more question here. If I go out and conduct a survey, but I don't see any bumblebees, how is that information recorded?
So that is very valuable information. If you do conduct a survey and you see 0 bumblebees, you definitely want to submit that still. There is a box for you to check that you didn't observe any bumblebees. So as you're submitting your habitat survey, you can just complete that. And when it asks you to move on to the bumblebees, you can just close the window. That will let us know that you didn't see any bumblebees out there. But that kind of information lets us know about the habitat that you were in, and we can start to understand why bumblebees aren't using that area. So zeros are still very important information.
So you're just Katie's gonna get into submitting data here. And so what you'll do is you'll fill out the habitat portion of the form and then save it. And then that survey will be saved with 0 bumblebees attached. And so we'll know that none were observed. But it is, as Katie mentioned, it is just as important, if not more important, to submit those data if you didn't find any. Because one of the reasons we're doing a project like this is we sort of have to infer absences when we look on the landscape for bumblebees with the data that we have. But a project like this allows us to actually say this species or this bee was not detected in that location. And so having those negative surveys are just absolutely essential. And then there's a couple questions here about can I survey in my suburban neighborhood? And then maybe what category would you select for a pollinator habitat planting as for the habitat category? And then I think you can move on.
Okay. Yes, you can survey in your suburban neighborhood if you can find a size that's big enough. If you survey in a restoration area, you want to mark it as it is. If it's in a woodland, if it's in a grassland, and there is a section in the notes where you can write down that this is a restored prairie or this is a high diversity mix, whatever you want to note down, that will be logged in the database.
There's a couple more. I think I'll just focus on typing answers, and why don't you go ahead and continue.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
All right, so all the data gets submitted to Bumblebee Watch, where you have already signed up, you have your account, you log in with your username. And let's see if the slide wants to move here. There we go. So to record a sighting, you're going to go to the top toolbar here where it says record a sighting. Let me get my pointer out. Right here, record a sighting. And then when you're submitting habitat data down here, you want to make sure that your project is selected as Great Plains Bumblebee Atlas. Having this selected is going to automatically tell the website to supply you with a space to enter your habitat data. If you're just uploading an incidental observation, like if you saw a bumblebee in your backyard or while you were walking the dog, you want to set your project to Bumblebee Watch, and that will allow you to just upload a photograph and a location. So for habitat surveys, you want to make it sure it's set to Great Plains Bumblebee Atlas. And then it's going to give you all of these options here for location. So in the search bar right here, you can type in the name of the place that you were, and it will automatically bring it up on the map and populate the latitude and longitude once you click the location on the map. Alternatively, you can enter in the latitude and longitude manually. You're going to want to give your location a site name, and this can be any site name that you want. You can save the site name in here. So if it's a site that you're going to be surveying multiple times and you've already entered a survey for it, you can search for your previous locations. You want to fill out your state and how accurate this is. So how it's going to ask you for a meter range, and you want to put down how close to the survey area are these coordinates. And you want to write down the date. And then you want to come down to the survey question. So everything that's on your habitat data sheet will have a drop-down box or a space to fill in the answers online. So you enter in your survey type, whether it was a point survey or a roadside survey, the collection method. Hopefully it was collected and photographed every bee. You want to put in the approximate size, how many surveyors there were, the start time and the end time, your active search time, temperature, cloud cover, wind speed. Any weather notes that you want to add is optional. And then you're going to move on to the habitat survey type. So if you were in a grassland or a wetland or a woodland, you choose the appropriate drop-down box. And then you have boxes for the surrounding habitat type. So again, the first one is required. If you fill out the first one, it will drop down to the second one. If you fill out the second one, it will give you an option for a third if there were 3 habitat types surrounding your area. And you have a box for your flowering resources. And then you have a checkbox for each of the nesting resources that you saw in or near your survey area. And then next will be the management dropdown. So for each one of the management regimes you saw going on in your survey area, you're going to click yes, no, or suspect. And then you're going to go down to the plants. So depending on how many plant species you saw in bloom is going to tell the computer how many spots to give you to enter plant names. So there's a location for a common name for the plant, as well as the scientific name. You do not have to fill out both. You can only fill out one. Try and be as specific as possible with you can with all of these plant names. And then at the end, it's going to be asking you about your volunteer effort. So if you did this as a volunteer, if not, and you were doing it for work and you were getting paid, just select no here. If you did volunteer, it's going to ask you for your time and your mileage. And then it's going to bring you to step 2. So if you did not observe any bumblebees and you see this green checkbox up here that says checklist has been saved, you can close the window right here and you're all done. If you did observe bumblebees, then you're going to want to start uploading your files. So the first thing you're going to want to do is hit this button that says choose files. And it's going to open up a window on your computer where you can choose the photos to upload. So each one of your rows on your data sheet is going to be uploaded separately here. So a few tips about the photos. If they are too dark, add some light before you upload them. Same with if they're too light, try and add some contrast to them before you upload them. Rich mentioned this in his video, but oftentimes if you can rest the bee on its back, it lets you take a better photo of the face. So here we can see the cheek length, the hair color on the front of the face, and the hair color on the top of the head when the bee is on its back. A fun thing, if you observe male bumblebees, some of them have these really cool mustaches. Not all of them, but some of them. Some of them can be orange, some of them can be black. I think that's fun when you're in the field to look at bee mustaches. If bumblebees get wet, they are very, very hard to identify and probably not very good for the bee itself. So before you go out surveying, make sure that your vials don't have cracks in them, especially if they are plastic vials. Make sure that the lid is screwed on all the way, and just make sure that there's no water getting into your vial when the bee is resting on ice. It's okay to have your fingers in the photograph. Sometimes the bees, when they're resting, they will have their wings over the abdomen, but you're going to need to pry those open. You can use your finger. Some people like to use a pencil tip. I've seen some people bring tweezers into the field to do it. Whichever method works best for you to pry those wings open. And flowers, if the bee holds on to the flower, it's okay to photograph the flower and the bee at the same time. So once you've got your photos uploaded and you don't know what kind of bee it is, you can click this identification tool here, and it will populate your photos on the left-hand side and then ask you a series of questions about the colors of the hairs on the face and the thorax. And based on what you click in these sections, it will give you some options here. So you don't have to enter in a species, right? You can just leave it right here. See how this says SP/Bumblebee. If you don't know the species, you can just leave it like this and an expert will identify it. And then once you've uploaded one bee, you can check it off on your data sheet, click save and click add another. And when you click add another, it's going to populate another space for you to upload your files, enter the species, enter the floral host. Any notes that you have for that particular bee, you can click the identification tool again. So if you saw 10 bees on one of your surveys, you're going to have 10 of these little sections for each of your bees. Okay, do we have any questions on that?
Let's see. There's a bunch more questions that are coming up, but they're not necessarily related to a data submission, although there was a question about what if I use iNaturalist? Can I just submit my bees there and will you get them? Or do I also need to put them into Bumblebee Watch?
So if you're conducting surveys, you will need to submit to Bumblebee Watch because iNaturalist does not allow us to collect the habitat data that we need. If you're just doing incidental observations, like it's a bumblebee from your backyard or while you're walking the dog, you can submit it to iNaturalist. That one is not always guaranteed that it'll be the correct identification because the identifications are crowdsourced, although the AI is getting very good at it. And there are a few experts that do regularly patrol iNaturalist. But if it is part of the atlas, you do need to submit to Bumblebee Watch.
And a question about sterilization. Should we clean our vials between bees or surveys?
Yes, definitely. To do that, you can use some mild soap and water, let them soak, rinse them out. That definitely decreases any pathogens or disease that we could be spreading between the bees. You use a percentage of bleach. Am I wrong in that, Rich?
Yeah, you can use like a 10% bleach solution, spray it on there and just let it air dry. Or let it soak for 10 minutes and like submerged in a mild bleach solution.
Okay, well, why don't we let's take a 5-minute break and come back and we'll do some bee identification for the rest of the time.
Okay, sounds good. We will see you all back here at around, oh gosh, I'm gonna show my time zone bias here. I think 7:15 Central Time, or 7:20. Let's come back at a little past 7:20 Central Time.
Nailed it. All right, hopefully everyone is making their way back. Okay, so in this part, we're going to talk about bumblebee identification. So how we even tell a bumblebee from a fly versus a wasp versus another bee, how you distinguish between male and female bumblebees. And then we're going to look at some of the species that you might encounter. So if this is your first time looking at bumblebee ID, it might seem a little bit overwhelming. Have no fear. It's something that you can pick up. In Kansas, there's only about 10 species. In the Dakotas, there's 24 species. So it's not something like you're going out and being faced with a bunch of different bird species or plant species. It is a manageable number. Once you start looking at them, it's can be fun to pick up. So this is where we're going to start. The first thing you want to figure out is if it's a bee or not a bee. And there are quite a lot of mimics out there that look like bumblebees. I should have put a poll up for this one, but I'll give you a few seconds to look at all of these different photographs and see if you can pick out which one is the bumblebee. You picked the dandelion, you're correct. So most of these other ones that we're looking at, all of the other ones are a type of fly. And they can look very, very similar to bumblebees. So the way that we tell those apart, bees will have 4 wings and flies will have 2 wings. Let me get my pointer back out. Okay, so when bees are in flight, their wings sort of attach together through a series of small hooks. So it might look like they have 2 wings, but when you have a chilled bee in front of you, you'll see that there are in fact 2 wings over here and 2 wings over here. Flies will only have 2. Their second pair of wings is now modified into what's called halteres, and it helps them balance. The next thing to tell a bee from a fly is look at their hind legs. So remember, bumblebees have, and other bees have evolved ways to collect and transport mass amounts of pollen. So if you see a bee carrying a large pollen mass, you're good to go. Flies, on the other hand, will oftentimes have very skinny chicken legs. Bees are usually hairy. So in the case of a bumblebee, it will be hairy. Flies are not always hairy. They can be, but not always. Certainly not as hairy as bumblebees are. The other thing to look at is the antennae. So bumblebees have these long elbowed antennae. They have a little elbow right here. Flies will typically have short, stubby antennae. And then lastly, you can look at the eyes. So bumblebees have eyes on the side of their face that do not meet in the middle. Most flies will have eyes that touch in the middle right here. And they're very bulgy, sort of like cartoon character insect eyes, right? That's what flies are going to have. To tell a bumblebee from a wasp, wasps do have 4 wings as well, but they will usually be folded like this. They don't carry very much pollen. They're not very hairy. And oftentimes the color patterns that we see are on their exoskeleton. So the exoskeleton of an insect is kind of like a fingernail, right? They don't have porous skin like we do. And the color patterns on a wasp are often on that exoskeleton, whereas the color patterns that we see on bumblebees are from different colored hairs. Okay, so now we've figured out that we've at least got a bee. The next step is to figure out if it's a bumblebee or another type of bee. And there are really only 2 kinds of bees that you could confuse with a bumblebee. One of those is a honeybee, right? They're kind of similar in size. They have those large pollen baskets on the hind leg. They do have some orange and black, but bumblebees do not have these hairy eyes here. Most of the time, all of the time, bumblebees are going to have colored hair, right? So again, this honeybee has color on its exoskeleton, not from hair. And the other thing you can notice is the shape. So honeybees often have this very torpedo-like shape, rather than a bumblebee that's kind of a little bit more chunky, robust, not like a torpedo. The next bee that you could confuse is a carpenter bee. So bumblebees, the first thing to notice is their abdomen are very hairy. Carpenter bees, on the other hand, are smooth, shiny, often reflective. You can also look at the hind leg. So bumblebees have that pollen basket, right? That shiny, hairless zone on their hind leg. Carpenter bees, on the other hand, are going to have scopy, that really dense hair on their hind leg. Carpenter bees often have a really large head too. I mean, so do bumblebees, but if you're looking at the two side by side, carpenter bees have a much larger head. Okay, so now got ourselves a bumblebee. Now we need to figure out if it's male or female, because the keys that we're providing you with are for female bumblebees. And that's because the survey time that we're out between June and September, most of the time you're going to be encountering female bumblebees, because male bumblebees are not reared until the end of the season. So in September, you could come across some male bumblebees, but most of the time we're going to be handling female bumblebees. So to tell the difference between those, females are usually a little bit more well-groomed, and the males tend to have a shaggier appearance, a little bit unkept. Females will also have a pollen basket on their hind leg down here. Male bees, however, do not, because they're not responsible for collecting pollen, so they did not evolve that pollen basket. So instead, they'll have lots of hairs here on their hind leg. Male bumblebees are also a little bit longer. So the abdomen of a bee, again, is broken up into 6 different segments. On the male bumblebee, they have 1 extra segment. So I'm not saying you have to go out and count these, but if you can see 6 different bands of color or 7 different bands of color, you can figure out if you have a male or a female bumblebee. Female bumblebees also have 10 antennal segments. So in here, there's 1, 2, 3, 4 very tiny antennal segments, and males have 11. Oftentimes, there are male bumblebees, well, not oftentimes, but depending on the species that you're dealing with, some male bumblebees have really long antennae, though still the same amount of segments. So if you have a bumblebee that has really long antennae, it's probably a male bumblebee. The next thing you can look at are the eyes. So there are some species of male bumblebees that have these really large bulbous eyes, not quite like flies because they still don't touch in the center. But if you look at this bulbous eye versus the female eye, that can be a clue as to which sex of bumblebee you're dealing with. And the last thing is a stinger. So male bumblebees do not have a stinger because a stinger is actually a modified egg-laying device. So there's no stinging male bees out there. Though with that said, I just want to note that females, yes, do have a stinger, but they're not on a mission to sting you, right? Most times they're trying to collect food and bring it back to the nest, or they're doing something to help maintain the nest or nurse the bees. They're never on a mission to sting us. And then the last part is figuring out whether you have normal bee or cuckoo bumblebee. So to tell these two apart, cuckoo bumblebees, like this one over here, usually have sparse hairs on their abdomen, right? You can see that it looks like it's almost balding. Other bumblebees will usually be pretty their hair will be very evenly distributed. Unless it gets later on in the season and the bees are getting closer to dying off, maybe they had a rough year, they'll probably be losing a little bit more hair too. So if that's the case, you can also look at the hind legs. Cuckoo bumblebees do not have a pollen basket either, because again, they're not going to be collecting pollen. They're invading the nest of a regular bumblebee and will take advantage of all the resources that are already collected. So once you know if you have a normal bumblebee or a cuckoo bumblebee, that's when you're going to turn to the identification sheets. So here on the left-hand side is the front and back of the identification sheet to the Dakotas. You can see there are many more species of bumblebees there than there are in Kansas. So depending on where you are, you might have a few more lookalike species. We have picked out the species that you could confuse with one another and put a little box here with the clues to help you differentiate them. There are the checklist of things that need to be photographed. There's an example of cheek length, the labeling of the parts. We've got a range map, the common name, a little characteristic about the bee. So it's not an in-depth guide, but it will certainly be a helpful sheet in the field. So here's for the Dakotas, and this is broken up into 5 different sections. So the sections are numbered down here. The first section is this box here, and these are bees where the first abdominal segment is black. And then we move down to section 2, and this is where bees that have white or pale hair are. There's only 3. In the third section is the first tergite is yellow. So the first abdominal segment right here. All of these bees have their first tergite as yellow. The fourth section is if you have a bee with any orange or red hair on it. You'll see that there are a couple here, the 2-form bumblebee and the red belted bumblebee. There are 2 color variants. So sometimes it might have orange, sometimes it might have black. Same with this species here. And then the 5th category over here are the cuckoo bumblebees. And for Kansas, since there's less species, it's set up a little bit differently. So you have 2 categories. The first one is if the first abdominal segment is yellow. So again, this part right here, these bees all have the first tergite as yellow. These bees, on the other hand, have the first tergite as black. So when we go through bumblebee identification, it's good to keep in mind that not every bee is going to match the pattern that's on the identification sheet, right? Bumblebees have different color patterns within species, and sometimes between queen and worker and male bees. They can have different sizes of bees. Their periods of activity can be different. So there's a lot of variation within the bumblebees, and there will not be one perfect example out there. As we go through all of the different species, we have it set up, so we're going to talk about 3 different main parts. The first part we're going to look at is the head. So we want to look at the colors on the front of the face, which here would be black, the colors on the top of the head, and then we want to move to the thorax. And on the thorax, again, we're looking for any patterns. Are we seeing a circle? Are we seeing a band? Are we seeing just a solid color? And then we want to look at the abdomen. So again, T1 stands for tergite 1. You want to look at all of the different colors on each of these tergites. And then you take the head, thorax, and the abdomen, look at those characters together, and that helps you figure out which species you're dealing with. So I'm going to start in the orange group. And the first one we have here is Hunt's bumblebee, or Bombus huntii. So you can see the front of its face has yellow hairs. The top has yellow hairs. On the thorax, it's got yellow in front of the wings and a black band between the wings, yellow behind the wings. And then on the abdomen, the first segment is yellow. The second and third are orange. The fourth is yellow, and you can't see 5 and 6, but those are both black. There's a species that looks quite similar to it if you're in parts of South Dakota or North Dakota, called the tricolored bumblebee or Bombus ternarius. This one has a mixing of black and yellow on its head. You can't quite see it in this photo. But what you want to notice on this bee is the notch right here. So it has a very similar color pattern to the last bee we just looked at, Hunt's bumblebee, but tricolored will have this notch. So here they are side by side. We have Hunt's bumblebee that just has the straight black band versus tricolored that has that notch or the black V. Next, we have the red belted bumblebee or Bombus rufosinctus. This one is extremely variable. We probably haven't even documented all the color variants that this bee has shown. The key characteristic that you can usually find though is that it has this yellow crescent on T2. So whether there is some orange here on T2 through T5, it usually has the yellow crescent. You can see it right here. It's got a little yellow part and then some orange on the edge. There's the central bumblebee or Bombus centralis. This one has a pretty reserved color pattern with T1 and 2 as yellow, T3 and 4 as orange, and then 5 and 6 are black. This one doesn't show up, at least in eastern Nebraska, I can say it doesn't show up in any high numbers. When I find it, it's usually been one individual in a sea of other bumblebees, but it does have a quite distinct color pattern. It's also one of the smaller bumblebees, though that can't always be a character to rely on because rufosinctus can also get quite tiny. Next, there's the two-form bumblebee or Bombus bifarius. Again, this is one of the bees that has a black form and a red form, found quite sporadically throughout. The front of this bee's head, although you can't see it in either of these photos, is usually white or yellow. This bee also has the black notch. And then it's variable here whether it's going to have orange or a little bit of yellow mixed in. This is usually a Western montane species, but you can see that it does pop up in some other spots. And then we have Morrison's bumblebee. This is a species of conservation concern. We haven't documented it in Nebraska recently, but it did appear just over the border last year, which was pretty exciting from this photo right here. This is a beautiful, very teddy bear-like bee, although I could describe a lot of bumblebees as flying teddy bears. This one is special in that form. It's got a beautiful yellow color to it. The thorax is unique in that it's all yellow. T1 through 3 is yellow, sometimes T4, and then 5 and 6 are black. And I'm gonna let Kelly take over here and tell you a little bit more.
Okay, so I'm starting with the common eastern bumblebee. This is a very common species. This is the first one I learned. It's pretty simple. The front of the head is black, top is yellow. The thorax is yellow with a black circle or teardrop in the center. And then the abdomen has T1 as yellow, and then the rest of the abdomen is black. This is one of the species that is commercially reared. And sometimes those domestic of sorts bumblebees, they do escape sometimes. Let's see, the next one is, oh, is it delayed? Oh, no, there it is, okay. The two-spotted bumblebee. This one is kind of similar to the common eastern bumblebee, except the abdomen. Let's see, the front of the head is black, the top is yellow, the thorax is yellow, and it has more of a defined black circle in the center. T1 is yellow, T2 has that sort of W shape. If you don't see a W right away, just think of it as two spots, like the name. And then T3 through 6 are black. This species tends to emerge a little bit earlier in the season, so that might just be a little helpful to know if you go out and do surveys earlier. The next one is the brown belted bumblebee. This is a very common species, so if you are worried about learning all of these, just try to learn this one first. The front of the head is black. The top of the head is black. The thorax is yellow with a black circle in the center. T1 is yellow. T2 is brown or yellow with kind of a crescent shape to it. And then T3 through 6 are black. Another defining characteristic of this species is that it has short, even hairs, kind of almost like a buzz cut. When I was learning bumblebees, this one stood out to me as like the brown crescent, just kind of reminded me of like a fanny pack if it's like flipped around. Next one. The half black bumblebee. The front is black hairs. The top has yellow hairs. The thorax is yellow with a black circle in the center. For the abdomen, T1 is yellow. T2 is also yellow. And then T3 through 6 are black. This species has really long, uneven hair. And I've noticed when I've been doing surveys, I can find this one in the woodlands in addition to grasslands. Then next, we have the Nevada bumblebee. The front of the face is black. The top of the head is black. Thorax is yellow with a black circle, and there's some yellow hairs mixed within. T1 is yellow or black. T2 and 3 is yellow, and then the rest of the abdomen is black. What you'll notice about this species is that it is quite chunky. It is just very robust, very rectangular. Then we have the Southern Plains bumblebee. The front and the top of the head, both black. The thorax, this is where it starts to differentiate a little bit from the previous bees that I've talked about. The yellow is in the front of the wings and behind the wings. And then one of the defining characteristics is that really pretty black stripe that's between the wings. T1 and T2 are yellow. T3 through T6 are black. In this species, the hairs lay very flat against the abdomen. To me, what really stands out to this for this species is the black stripe on the abdomen, and sometimes they can have like really pretty dark wings. All right, then the American bumblebee. The front and the top of the head all have black hairs. The thorax is yellow in front of the wings. There's that black stripe between the wings again. And then behind the wings, it can be either black or yellow. For the abdomen, this is kind of one of the defining characteristics for this species that I came across first. T1 is half black, half yellow. Then T2, T3 are yellow, and then the rest of the abdomen is black. When I've been in the field, I've noticed that this is a really striking species just when I see them foraging. Then we have the black and gold bumblebee. The, excuse me, the front of the head is black. The top of the head has yellow hairs. The thorax has yellow in front of the wings and yellow behind the wings with the black stripe between the wings. The abdomen varies a little bit and it can get a little confusing. We'll talk about it a bit more. T1 is black, T2 and T3 yellow, T4 through 6 black. So this one can look kind of similar to the American bumblebee. The defining characteristics between the two are the hairs on top of the head. Black and gold has the yellow hairs on the top. American has black hairs. And then the other defining characteristic is that the American Bumblebee really has that half black, half yellow T1. Then next, we have the yellow bumblebee. The front and the top of the head are both black. The thorax is yellow in front and behind of the wings with a narrow black band between the wings. And then the abdomen, T1 through 4, all yellow. T5 and T6 are black. I really noticed that the species, when they're out foraging and I see one, I'm like, wow, that's a really yellow bee. So if you survey later in the season, you might come across male American bumblebees, and they can look similar to Bombus Mixtus, the yellow bumblebee. What really sets them apart is that Bombus Mixtus has that yellow on the side of the thorax. It just looks kind of crisp, kind of neat. And then on male American bumblebees, they'll have kind of that cloudy look to them. They'll have the black hairs mixed in with the yellow hairs on that side of the thorax. And then another defining characteristic is that there will be orange hairs at the tip of the abdomen. It's not always there in male American bumblebees. It's kind of variable, but usually I found that there are at least a few orange hairs there. Then, oh, and we have more. Okay, perfect. Another defining characteristic, you kind of get that cloudy look on their face as well. They will have the yellow hairs mixed in with the black hairs for American bumblebee males, versus Bombus Mixtus will just have that really nice all black hairs. And then the last one is the northern antler bumblebee. This one is kind of similar to Bombus Mixtus. The main difference is that it is almost entirely yellow. The front of the head is pale yellow. The top of the head is yellow. The thorax is yellow in front of the wings and behind the wings. And there will be that nice stripe between the wings that's black. T1 through 5, all yellow. And then the very tip of the abdomen, T6, is black.
Thanks, Kelly. All right, we just have a few more to go here. We do have a third very yellow bumblebee known as the white-shouldered bumblebee, or Bombus Mixtus. This one you'll notice it's called the white-shouldered bumblebee because it has pale white hairs on its shoulders, if you think about that being the shoulder of the bumblebee. It also has this really beautiful hay straw golden hair on its abdomen. You'll see that this one is quite restricted though. It hasn't been observed in Nebraska since we've been doing the atlas, but I hope somebody comes across it in the Black Hills at least. There's the yellow banded bumblebee. So these are the bees now that have white or pale hairs. So if you're in Kansas, you won't be seeing these species unless you take a trip up to at least South Dakota. Yellow banded bumblebee, or Bombus Tricola, has yellow with black mixed in on the front of its face. It's got yellow in front of the wings and then black on the remainder of the thorax. The key thing about this species is this yellow pale band that it has here on T5. So it won't be the whole band that's going across, but it's got these different colored hairs down here. A similar species to that one is the western bumblebee that also has a tail to it, if you will. It's got black hairs with some yellow mixed in on the front of its face and the top of its head. It will have yellow hairs in the front of the wings, black band, and then black, or it'll be cloudy with some yellow mixed in. The majority of the abdomen will be black with a white tail, so there is potential that there could be some yellow here. Next, we have the cuckoo bumblebees. So I've only put a couple of cuckoo bumblebees in there because most of them have not been seen since the early 2000s. But the lemon cuckoo bumblebee, or Bombus Bombus is one that you could come across. So the front of its face is black, but it can also have yellow. The top of its head is yellow, like you see here. The thorax is usually all yellow, even the sides. And the abdomen can have some yellow on T1, like you see this little patch here on the side of its abdomen. And then T3 can also have some sporadic yellow coloration going on. Again, these bees will look like they're balding. Their hair is a lot more sparse than regular bumblebees, and you can also check out the hind leg to see if it has that pollen basket or not. Cuckoo bumblebees will not have a pollen basket. And we have the indiscriminate cuckoo bumblebee, Bombus insularis. You can see that this one is definitely showing that balding, sparse hair look of the cuckoo bumblebees. The front of its thorax will have this nice yellow band here, and then most of the bee will be black until you get down to T3 or T5 that could have some yellow along the sides here. Cuckoo bumblebees don't usually show up in large numbers. I feel like I have to admit this. I've never seen a cuckoo bumblebee in real life, so I'm hoping this is going to be the year. I've been hoping that it's going to be the year for about 4 years now, so maybe 5th time's the charm. And then the last species I want to talk about is the rusty patch bumblebee. This one will have a nice rusty patch here should you come across it, but it is very, very unlikely that you will do so. This is a federally protected species listed on the Endangered Species Act. Its range has decreased substantially in the past couple of decades. And we've highlighted grid cells in here that occur with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service map. So all of these shaded areas here that you see are the historic range, excuse me if you hear my cat, are the historic range of the bumblebee that are considered unoccupied. So we don't expect there to be rusty patch bumblebees in these shady areas anymore. But we would like you to be aware if you're surveying in one of these grid cells. There's a little pocket guide that can teach you about the identification of it. And if you do come across the species, we would like you to stop your survey and contact your state's Ecological Services Office of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. There is a contact for both North Dakota and South Dakota in the handbook and on the website for who to contact if you do come across this. But again, it is very, very unlikely. And with that, we are done. I hope you didn't get too overwhelmed with all the bumblebee species. I hope you're looking forward to getting out there and finding some of your own. Do we have any questions to take care of? Doesn't look like it.
I don't think so. I haven't seen any new ones pop up anyway.
That either means we completely nailed identification and everybody got it, or they just walked away from their screen. Too much.
Perhaps a mix of both.
Yeah.
Barbara just asked, what happens if they find a dead bumblebee?
Well, you can still take a picture of it and upload it to Bumblebee Watch. I think that's all I can say towards that. Do you have anything to add, Rich?
I guess I would say that if you think it's one of these sensitive species that we've mentioned, like could be Suckley's cuckoo bumblebee or the western bumblebee or the rusty patch bumblebee, those are probably worth collecting, and you know, the best thing to do would be to probably keep it in one of your jars and throw it in the forest in the freezer, and then just get in touch with one of us. And you know, we'd probably ask you to send us some photos and see if you know, what species it was, and we may ask you to send it to us in a if it is one of those, you know, sensitive species, so we can get some more information about it. So but yeah, generally speaking, take some photos of it and you know, you can just leave it in the environment if it's a common species. But I will also say that if you're in an area where you see a lot of dead bumblebees, like the pictures that I showed last night, it could indicate some sort of pesticide poisoning. And I would recommend that you, in that situation, contact your state Department of Agriculture, who likely has authority over pesticides and often has a phone number or a website for for pesticide kills. But when I say large number, I mean hundreds of bumblebees, not tens of bumblebees. So just keep that in mind. They just need enough material to, anyway, yeah, I think you understand. You don't need to get into the details.
And Joan's asking about the recordings. We will email everybody who registered for the Zoom sessions when the recordings have been posted on the website. How do we get the paper info? The handbook, if you're talking about the handbook, it is online on bumblebeeatlas.org. We have everything that we detailed tonight in a nice little document for you. If you want to print the data sheets, they are also online. The identification sheet is online. Everything is available for you in the training packet. And Lynette is asking about the grid on the data sheet. So the video that we showed earlier was a video that we recorded a couple years ago, and we weren't using the photo grids on the data sheet yet. This is actually the first year that we're using those grids to see if we can gain a sense of scale with the photographs. So when you're in the field, please try to photograph the bumblebees on the grids that are on the data sheet. If it's not possible, that is totally okay.
I just wanted to add real quick. I know ID might be overwhelming at first. I'd recommend just trying to learn two species, like two really common species in your area. And then this kind of highlights the importance too of taking really good photos, because if you're not sure what a species is, you can submit the data and then check back when one of us IDs that bumblebee. That's kind of what I did. I learned as I went.
Yeah, I think that is very true. I remember getting into the ID being, it's a different language at first, but just as with birds or plants, you know, you have to start somewhere with it. Lynette is ready to go. She says, when can we start? Survey season opens June 1st. So you have a good amount of time right now to buy your net, buy your vials, get ready to go. Oh, I should mention one more thing. We'll be hosting a series of field days throughout each of the states. Registration for those is going to open very soon, likely tomorrow morning. We have 2 events in North Dakota, 3 events in South Dakota, 2 events in Kansas, and there is another workshop going on for Missouri Bumblebee Atlas that will be an in-person version of what we just did online, and that will be in Kansas City. So make sure to check on the website under the events page if you want to register for those field events. Rich just dropped the link in the chat. And those are optional events, but it will be a chance to sort of get in the field with myself or with Kelly and learn how to swim nets, how to handle bees, ask any questions that you might have.
Katie, can I say something about one of the field events?
Of course.
This is Charlie, for those of you who don't know me, but the morning before the event, right, Katie? You're doing it in the afternoon?
Yeah, that one's going to be with South Dakota Master Naturalists, if anybody is on.
Oh, and others. But there is a butterfly festival in the morning, so you could come do that and then stick around and do the field event too. Just saying, if you don't have anything else to do.
Charlie, do you want to share the date and location for that? I mean, maybe everybody knows what you're talking about, but
it is July 16th.
Okay.
Which is a Saturday. It's called Little Wings on the Prairie. We go from 9 to noon, and then the field event is in the afternoon. Oh, and it's at Oahe Downstream. If you can find the recreation area, we will be pretty obvious because we have 8-foot monarch wings out.
Any 8-foot bumblebee wings? Yeah.
I'm gonna have to work on that.
Okay. Next year.
Yeah, next year.
All right, well, if there are no more questions, thank you for attending 2 nights in a row with us. If you do have any lingering questions that come up later, feel free to use the email address on the website. And we'll be here to assist throughout the season and beyond. So thank you for hanging out with us again tonight.
And I'll just chime in again. Fish and Wildlife Service certainly thanks everybody that's helping, and I hope you guys have a good time and find lots of bumblebees.